I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about the Office of Comptroller. I would expect in this audience that most of you are familiar with the office, know a little bit about it, may know a little bit about its history. It is an office, unfortunately, that the public doesn't know very much about, and so I want to talk about why it's so important. I've been visiting with folks around Texas who are concerned about our state and not in the business, but in the business of funding political candidates and races. And there seems to be a lot of focus on the Texas House in particular, feeling like we haven't gotten the sort of conservative leadership out of the House that we've wanted in the House. And I've tried to make the case that there's a lot of shell game that goes on in politics, and we get control of the Texas House. Some of the dirty dealings will happen in the Senate, and some of the dirty dealings will happen in the executive branch, and it's very important as grassroots activists, if we want to truly start to see the sorts of limited constitutional republic ideas that most of us would hold dear, we have to put limited conservative individuals, limited government conservative individuals in each branch of government. Texas is, as you know, going to see a sea change in our leadership in 2014. Our governor has determined that he is going to retire from public office. There is potentially the same individual returning as the lieutenant governor, but virtually every other statewide office will have a new face in it come 2015. Comptroller is statewide. She has announced that she's retiring. The land commissioner, statewide elected, he's running for lieutenant governor, and you can only run for one office at a time. So since the lieutenant governor's office and the land commissioner are both on the ballot, that creates an open seat at land commission. It creates an open seat at ag commission. So we really have new leadership coming in Texas, and I think an opportunity unlike any of us have seen really in the last 20 plus years to look critically at the sort of leadership that we're choosing for our state. Unfortunately, I believe unfortunately, in most of those races, what we have is folks who have been a part of the system for 10, 15, 20 years. The same individuals who stand up every session and tell us what a great job they did for us, how hard they worked in their office, and yet we see the problems that probably got us to a meeting like this in the first place just kind of growing from year to year and session to session. I actually was drawn into the political arena on a life issue. I was invited, encouraged by my pastor to go to a precinct meeting. I didn't know what a precinct meeting was, but I went. 2 years later, I went to the county convention, and at the county convention saw the deacons of my little rural First Baptist church vote to eliminate the pro-life plank in the Republican Party platform, and I did that. A little more than that, it grieved me to my soul, and that was the thing that hooked me into politics. It made me say, oh my gosh, if these men, the leaders of my local church, we probably had 200 people in a Sunday service. We all thought we knew each other pretty darn well. And I get into the political realm and they're voting against the pro-life plank in the Republican Party platform. I bet there's a whole bunch of areas where we're not going to agree. If we don't agree on that, there's a whole bunch more. And what else is happening in the halls of government while I am raising my family? And I began to pay attention. I was the county chairman the year that we first got a Republican majority in the Texas House. And I say that we first got because we hadn't had a Republican majority in the Texas House since the Civil War, but we got one in our lifetime. And I thought, oh boy, we're finally going to get all those things that we've been not getting. I'm going to fix public education. Remember that? We were fighting over how public education was going to be financed, and the Republicans knew that we didn't need to spend more money on it. Now we have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican executive statewide, so it's done. And it wasn't done. And I began to fuss over my dinner, just that dadgum Republican Party, just what are they doing? And I looked in the mirror one day and thought, Deborah Medina, I bet if you think the Texas Republican Party is somewhat responsible for what's happening in Austin, I bet you're, as the county chairman, a little bit responsible for what's happening in your own courthouse. And I wondered what was happening in my own courthouse. And so I decided to look at my courthouse, much like many of us look at Washington, D.C. or the federal government. And I found that in the state of Texas, there are 8 counties that are statistically comparable to my own. Little rural, 40,000 people, Wharton County. And I began to plot their financial expenditures, because how much money should one little rural county spend? Should their budget be 10 million or 15 million or 20 million, or what's the right number? And on every metric that I plotted, there were 7 counties that kind of clustered. If you ever done any statistics or graphing, you know how that works. And there's 7 that clustered, and mine was way out here. And I suddenly became very familiar with CAFRAs. I had worked in private hospitals and healthcare organizations my whole adult life. I'm a registered nurse by profession, and I had been a manager, and I was fortunate, very fortunate, in 1990 to go to work for a company called Health Trust. Health Trust was a little hospital system that had been put together by some savvy executives when Hospital Corporation of America sold off a bunch of its underperforming hospitals that were never going to be able to make anything. We're just going to sell them for a nickel on the dollar and get them off of our books. And these men bought them up, and they sold a few of them and kept the rest. And within a year, it was the most profitable hospital corporation in the country. And I was a young manager in that organization. And I remember sitting down the first time with my chief financial officer, and there was toilet paper on my budget. Now, I'm a nurse manager. I was used to paying for nursing hours and only nursing hours. I wasn't used to paying part of the dietitian's salary or part of the electric bill or the toilet paper or the trash cans. Those were housekeeping expenses and dietary expenses. And they said, no ma'am, you're the manager of this unit, and you need to understand every cost associated with running this division of this hospital. And so it was a great learning experience for me. I had been working on a business degree for a number of years, and so that was really the place that I think I really learned to analyze financials and understand what they meant. And then a few years after that, here I am looking at the comprehensive annual financial report of not only my county, but the other 8 counties. I think they thought I was crazy when I'd call them up and say, my name is Deborah Medina, and I'm the Republican county chair, and I called every auditor in those other 8 counties, and I went over their comprehensive annual financial report to make sure that I understood how their county was operating and how mine was different and why mine might be different, and did I really get this? So this office is a good fit for me. If you followed my gubernatorial campaign, I carried that CAFRA with me, because when I told you that the state of Texas had $38 billion worth of debt, I could see the BS things on foreheads in every audience that I talked to. They said, that's not true. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Our state budget's balanced. We couldn't have $38 billion worth of debt. But when I began to hold up that CAFRA and point to the page in the CAFRA where it said we had $38 billion worth of debt as a state, people suddenly started to believe that we did. And the comptroller has done a good job, particularly over the last few years, of letting us know really not only do we have a problem with our state debt, but really more egregiously than that, we have a huge problem with local debt and spending. And why is that? Why are our local elected officials saddling us with so much debt? If we looked at the level of debt in Texas, local debt, that's your city, your school district, your county, your municipal utility district, your fire and water district, your emergency service district, your rural hospital district. $234 billion worth of local debt in the state of Texas. If we did a per capita average on that debt, you and I carry the second highest debt burden in the country, right here in Texas. If we combine our local debt burden with the state burden, and then we just look at per capita, how does somebody in California stack up to somebody in New York, somebody in Pennsylvania, somebody in Illinois, somebody in Florida, somebody in Texas? If we just looked at those states and all of their state and local, not to mention federal, this is just state and local debt, what have we done to ourselves in our own communities and in our own state? You and I here in Texas have the 5th largest debt burden in the country. Now, we are a large state, but we're pretty proud of telling ourselves that our economy is booming. If you got the 5th largest level of debt when your economy is booming, how on earth are you going to survive the next bust? And why is that happening? Well, I'd submit to you that it's happening because we don't understand the difference between, I often say, between policies that keep us free and those that lead to poverty. We don't know the difference. But at the end of the day, we don't know the difference between what creates a free market and what doesn't. So when somebody comes out with an idea, if you would just contribute $25 million a year over the course of the next 10 years, Formula One racing in Texas would create what? Jobs, tax revenue. Isn't that a good thing? Yes, it's a good thing. But it's not the role of government to take your money and put it in somebody's idea of a sound investment, is it?
That's right.
Right? If you want to be an investment banker, go be an investment banker. All the more power to you. But quit taking money from your neighbors to go invest in your next good idea. And we do that in Austin every day, all day long. What's the cliche? 6 times a week and twice on Sunday. We don't understand the difference. How many of you believe that a free market economy is the economy that is most likely to give the greatest number of people the greatest level of prosperity?
Oh, yeah.
If we believe that, if we really believe that, then we've got to start putting our foot down every time the next socialist, fascist idea comes along. And that's what they are. Every time we turn around, we see the whole herd, Republicans all, red, all of us, they're us. I'm not being critical of somebody else. This is the log in my eye. We're part of this process, and we applaud these guys. We re-elect them, we put them back up there. We've got to pull them aside and say, that idea you have, I think I quoted earlier that the notion that we would immunize every college student against meningitis. Did you know that passed our legislature?
Yes. Yeah, my son just said it.
Yeah, got to do that. Good idea? Maybe. Maybe you want to do that for your college student. Maybe you don't. It's not the role of government to make that decision. It's really great for the pharmaceutical company, by the way.
Exactly.
Sure.
You know, if you want it, can you find a bigger market than the state of Texas, every college student in the state of Texas? How do you like that deal? We'll just let the government sell for your company. Because that's what that was about. And I'm a nurse. I could get into the efficacy of that treatment and whether or not it really did cure anybody or prevent any disease or prevent any problem. It's not the job of government, but we don't understand that. We all march because it sounds good. We don't think about what is the role of government. The comptroller's office is a constitutionally established office. The comptroller is the treasurer the Chief Financial Officer of the state of Texas. So what all can they really do? Deborah, you're talking about all these great and wonderful ideas. How much opportunity do you have to really change the course in Texas? One of the first things the comptroller does in every biennium is to provide to the legislature a revenue estimate. What is that? That is an estimate of, if things stay the same, given our current tax structure, given our current level of economic productivity, or what is predicted to happen over the course of the next 2 years, this is how much revenue the state of Texas will bring in. State of Texas fiscal year starts September 1st, not October 1st like the federal year, September 1st. So when the legislature comes in to Austin in January, they are finishing up the last 8 months of the current biennium. And they are establishing the budget for the next 2-year period, which will begin September 1. And that revenue estimate is what they use to decide how much money they can spend. They are to use that estimated amount of money to budget all of the functions of state government over the course of the next 2 years. They then come back to the comptroller and say, here's how we propose to spend this money to meet the obligations of the state of Texas, and the comptroller certifies the budget. I have said in many public forums it should not have been certified in the 82nd legislative session. I don't know if we've had any elected official in Texas say that, but we certainly have had a lot of us in the private sector say it shouldn't have been certified. Why shouldn't it have been certified? How many of you have heard it didn't fund Medicaid? You heard that it didn't fully fund Medicaid?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Well, what that means is the state said, these are the services that our Medicaid program is going to pay for. Let me make it real simple. 24 months, most of you have a house payment or a rent of some kind. If you're setting up your budget for 24 months, you take your current house payment or your current rent for the place that you live and you multiply it times 24, and that's what it's going to cost. If you give me a budget that only covers 18 months of that 24 months, it ain't a balanced budget.
Right.
And that's what we did with Medicaid. We said, these are all the services that we're going to provide. This is how many people in Texas are going to be eligible to receive those services. This is how much they're going to cost, and we funded 75% of that number. Knowing that the legislature would be back in Austin in January, that there was 8 months left in the biennium, and that they could figure out then what to do with filling that hole. That's not a balanced budget. The comptroller has historically refused to certify the budget. It doesn't have to be a big public spectacle. It is a close working relationship with the House and the Senate to stay abreast of what they're proposing, to make sure that they understand whether or not the budget is certifiable. I think we need to be looking very closely. You know, the Texas Constitution is a very long document, right? It's not near as cut and dried as the U.S. Constitution is. We need to be looking very closely at what things the state is mandated to cover. Public education is one of those things. I think we're missing the boat, and I think we're missing the argument on public education. Do you know what our Constitution says about public education? So that our children will understand liberty, the state of Texas will provide a free public education for the general dissemination of knowledge. Anybody doing more than generally disseminating knowledge in your local public school? Is that a bad thing? I don't think it is. The question is, how much of that does the state pay for? So you don't have a duty to pay for public ed in my county that goes beyond general dissemination of knowledge. If I want more for my kids than general dissemination of knowledge, that's my job. If I want more for the children in my community, I live in a rural farm ag community. Lots of boys in my community need to be good diesel mechanics. And probably companies that sell equipment to farmers and ranchers would be pretty interested in whether or not they could sell equipment in my county. They might fund a teacher to come in and teach diesel mechanics at the local high school a couple of days a week, you think? But see, we don't need that in every school in the state. We just need it in some places, and that ought to be up to the independent school district, right? But who's talking about what the Constitution says about public education? Have you even heard that before? We all take an oath. I took one as a Republican county chairman, and every elected official has taken one to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America and of the great state of Texas. So if we're going to uphold it, we have to read it. We have to know what it says. And if it doesn't say what it needs to say, then we need to have a conversation about that. And we need to figure out how to perfect it so that it does say what it means. Right now it says public education is the responsibility of the state so that our children would understand liberty. We're going to pay for a general, I said dissemination, and the word might actually be diffusion. It's the meaning I think is pretty close there, but it might be diffusion, a general diffusion of knowledge. I heard a city council member once stand up and say, until we decide what that is, I had someone ask me when we were talking about this just a couple of weeks ago, is that art? And I said, well, I don't know. Is it art and music? My children are very musical, and their piano teacher was always giving me articles that said children who took music early on were better at math and science than children who didn't. Connects some synapses in the brain that allow you to be able to process some higher level functioning that without that, you're not as effective as doing. Or is that a conversation we need to be having? What is general diffusion of knowledge? Let's figure out what that is as the people of the state of Texas, and then we'll understand what the state ought to be paying for in public education. And then we'll understand what independent school districts get to do, all the rest. Maybe we'd get out of the courts. We wouldn't be going back to the courts every few years to let the judges tell us whether or not we're adequately funding public ed in Texas. See, we haven't defined it. We've ignored what the Constitution says about it, so how can we decide if it's adequately funded when we don't even know what it is? It keeps getting bigger, this thing we're buying every time we go back to the courts. So there's a real opportunity for the comptroller to look at those sorts of issues, to look at what the Constitution says and to engage in a conversation with the public and with the legislature about what the job is of the state. How do we take money from our citizens, and what do we do with that money when we get it? Do we use it for economic development, or do we use it to fund public education and roads and infrastructure and law enforcement? What do we use it for? And unfortunately, what we've seen in the last few sessions is that we've used it for a lot of non-essential things during the regular session, and then we've come back in special sessions and we've gone after more debt, or we've gone after a repurposing of the Economic Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund. Let's take money from there. I said, I have an idea. You know, the Rainy Day Fund is the Economic Stabilization Fund for Texas. You've heard a lot about that over the course of the last several months. It is tax revenue generated by the oil and gas industry, and it is dedicated to the Rainy Day Fund, Economic Stabilization Fund, to a certain level. Once it reaches that level, the state said we've got enough in our savings account, basically, in our Rainy Day Fund. Any additional revenue that comes in should be diverted into the general revenue fund to be appropriated by the legislature however they determine appropriate. And I said, I've always kind of been of the opinion that when you give government all the money that it needs, you quit giving it anymore. When we talk about sales tax holidays, how about we have a rainy day tax holiday? When that oil and gas business gets out there and starts working overtime to be really, really productive, should they be punished? Or should they pay their dues and make a little more profit? See, why don't we consider saying, once that fund reaches a certain level, that they get a holiday? That's not another exemption. That's you've paid what we need. We've decided. I'm not sure that the mechanism that we use to fund that fund is the most just one or the most equitable one. But I certainly wonder about an industry that is producing enough to meet that need, having to continue to produce and produce. If they were able to dedicate those resources back into their own development, how much more productive and efficient would they be? So I think there's lots of opportunity all around Texas for a comptroller to really lead, get outside, think outside the box, and lead on limited government ideas. We've got major tax reform initiatives that need to be undertaken. Our tax system is broken, and it is evidenced by the great level of local debt. Your local communities are going into debt because they are providing more service than they are able to afford with the revenue that's currently coming into their coffers. Now, either you've got to decide as local citizens that you want less service, or we've got to look for a tax structure that is least distorting to the free market, least distorting to businesses producing, and still able to fund the cost of local government. The system we have in place today has its roots in our earliest days as a state. Does Texas look anything today like it did in 1870? Do you think maybe what we were doing then is really the best model to be using for the economy that we are today? But rather than kind of backing up and looking at what would be the best structure, gosh, I've had lots of proposals for tax reform, and I hate all of them. I hate all of them. And my economic advisor said, Deborah, you're never going to find a good one. What you have to do is look for the least bad one. They're all bad. So when we look at tax, we have to look at which one is least bad. And then move, not overnight, because we've been in this one for well over 100 years. Let's move gradually from that bad thing to something that's least bad. What is that? And it's not tweaking. It's saying that one may have served our state well when we were primarily an agrarian, ag-driven economy. We are not primarily, it's important. My county might still be primarily agrarian and ag-driven, but our state is not. We've got health care and oil and gas and ag and what's the word I'm looking for? Intellectual property issues. Our industry is very diverse, much more than most states, which has in large part, allowed us to kind of weather the storms that some of these other states have undergone. And so we're doing okay. But we've got the 5th largest level of debt in the country, and we're at some of our most prosperous times right now. What are we leaving our children if we're not courageous enough to really do the hard work I often say the intellectual heavy lifting that's going to be necessary to find good policy, it's not easy. And it's going to require us listening to one another. I've said the 82nd legislative session, I've been committed to eliminating the property tax. The 82nd session, I had a plan, even got it drafted into a bill, couldn't find an author for it. It was so insufficiently developed that nobody wanted to sign on and sponsor it. But we kept going, and we came back in the 83rd, and actually, I didn't think we had a bill. I didn't think we were ready. I didn't think we had gotten far enough. And George Lavender, bless his heart, state rep out of Texarkana, said, Deborah, we got to start with something, and this has got to be done. And I'm filing a bill, and you better give me a good bill I can file. Get me something. I'm going to file it because we've got to start the discussion. And so we filed a bill. It was maybe the largest bill filed in the session. It's over 300 pages long. And I've said to several people, I'm sure if you read that bill, you can find lots wrong with that bill. And it's important that we hear that and that we understand what's wrong with it. But it's also important that we use that as a place to make it better. It's going to take us 3 or 4 sessions to get it perfected. But if we will really look at how do we take money from people and what do we do with it when we get it, then we have a real opportunity as a state to really not be just doing okay, but to be really prosperous. Because there is no state in the nation, and probably no place on the face of the earth, that has the combination of natural resources and a diverse and innovative people like the state of Texas does. It is people that make a society prosperous. It is us coming together and producing that does that. And if you challenge me on that, I'd ask you to look at Africa and look at Japan and see the difference in those economies and know that it's not natural resources alone. It's you and I working together that will give us a truly prosperous economy. But if we are lazy and we allow the mediocrity to continue, then what we pass on to the next generation is a state that's doing all right when it could have been great. I want to lead on that. I don't have all the answers. But I think if you look at my life at all, you will see that I will push. I will push and push and push, and I will challenge not just myself, but the leaders of my party and the leaders of our state to do it better. I'll make some mistakes. I'll try not to make mistakes, and I'll try to do it better the next time. I'm fighting another uphill battle here. This is going to be a tough, hard race in many respects because nobody cares about it. And it's hard to get people's attention when they don't understand that the office is an important one. It's an important one regardless of who serves in it. It's an important one to me because I think we have great opportunity to lead there, to have somebody that's watching the purse strings, that understands what a free market looks like, that will surround herself with not just the same old mediocre ideas that we've been dealing with, but people who have the courage to get outside that box, look at history, look at different theories of economics, and understand what creates a free market so that Texas really begins to shine, to really shine. I need your help for that. I appreciate it. I think I'm supposed to take some questions.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, if you would take some questions.
I will.
If anybody has any questions.
Yes, sir.
What do you think the responsibility and the authority of the Texas Comptroller?
Well, some of that's defined in the Constitution. The chief financial officer of the state, the treasurer of the assets. I have on a flyer, Sarah, why don't you go ahead and start that clipboard around. We've got a clipboard that you can sign up for our email address if you want, and there's also a flyer there. But I've identified, because it's a big office, 2,800 employees, I've identified kind of 3 general things that I think need focus. One is the administration of tax collections. There is concern in the public that the laws are not being consistently and uniformly administered. So while we can argue, and we should, about perfecting the code that's on the books has to be uniformly and equitably applied. We need the office to lead on the ideas of advancing a free market, and then the third thing I have there is looking at the things that the state could or should be doing to protect the Texas economy in an unsteady, unstable global and U.S. marketplace. Are there things that, as the state of Texas, we could be doing? The comptroller has purview over the state's assets, and during the housing bubble burst, we lost 38% of that value. Are there things that we could be doing as a state to protect not only the assets of the state, but the businesses and the people that live here from that sort of economic turbulence, and what are those things? So those three primarily.
What is the authority does comptroller have to address a lot of things in your speech that's wrong with Texas and has been problems with Texas with the legislature and the governor and lieutenant governor, but what can the comptroller do about any of that?
Well, I'm not sure.
Do you have any authority in your
Well,
position?
I thought I answered that. You set you estimate the revenue, and you certify the budget, or you don't certify the budget. You collect the taxes. You determine how this law is going to be applied or enforced. You have the Texas Safekeeping Trust Company in your office, which invests the assets of the state of Texas. So looking at how those assets are invested and whether or not you need to work with the legislature to change those investment policies. Some of them are under the purview directly of the comptroller, and some require legislative change or intervention for how that can be done. There's broad authority. It's a statewide elected office, so it's up to the comptroller in many respects how those tasks that are designated to the comptroller are in fact carried out.
Maybe to clarify, as an example, you talked about the issues with public education in Texas. So as comptroller in that office, what impact would you have on
Well,
figuring
I think you go back to the legislature and you say, this is what's been appropriated, this is what the Constitution says needs to occur. How much of these dollars do that, and how much of these dollars go beyond that? Because to the degree that those dollars go beyond that general diffusion of knowledge, it's not appropriate use of the state's tax dollars to be funding that. So demonstrate that this money that you've appropriated is general diffusion of knowledge. Where does it meet that requirement, and where does it exceed that? And where it exceeds that, it shouldn't be certified.
So it becomes a sort of a recommendation to the legislature?
Or certification or
Or
If
not
the comptroller doesn't deny certifying the budget,
And then what
there's no
happens?
budget. And it goes back to the legislature until those issues are resolved.
But you specify why it's not certified.
Right, right.
That you've exceeded your constitutional limit here
correct.
and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and obviously that's going to be a tug of war, right? Because the legislature's going to say, yes, we can spend it that way. The comptroller's going to say, no, you cannot. And it may be over public ed, it may be over transportation funding, it may be over criminal justice funding. I mean, there could be any area in the budget where the comptroller says this is not appropriate or allowed use of these funds. We can't spend this money this way, and refuse to certify the budget. Yes, sir?
In the past, has anything like that, I'm sure it's come up many times, but the public doesn't know about it?
Sometimes the public does, and many times they don't. If you'll go back and read, Bob Bullock is probably, kind of one of the most flamboyant individuals to ever have occupied that office, and some of his biography talking about some of the issues that occurred there and some of the things that he would do right or wrong, it's a statewide elected office, and there are ways to do that. One of the things that we're exploring is, and I may have mentioned it to you earlier, the Constitution has a provision in there that says the comptroller may accept federal funds. Well, if I hear that, I think that might also mean may not. So when the federal government says, here, Texas, we're going to give you these education dollars provided you do X, Y, and Z, if you were asked to sign a contract, don't you have the right to negotiate some of the terms of that contract?
Absolutely.
So why do you just sign whatever they give you? What happens if the comptroller starts saying, not with these strings attached, we're not taking that money? And if the comptroller does that in a vacuum, y'all are all going to be mad at the comptroller, and rightly you should. But if the comptroller goes to the legislature and says, I have some real concerns about these terms, and the comptroller goes to the public and says, do you know what they're trying to make us do in the state of Texas? How many of you get on the phone to your congressman and tell your congressman that stuff's got to stop? Those terms have got to change. When do we talk about pushing back on the federal government all the time. Do you know how dependent we are on the federal government? 35% of our state's budget is federal dollars. 35%. We better start figuring out how that number goes down. It went up by about a point this time. I believe in the last biennium it was 33.5 or 34. And this coming biennium that started, the one we're in now, the one that started September 1st, is 35% of our budget. So we've got to start looking for ways to take care of ourselves. That's not going to happen overnight. And to push on the requirements that the federal government is shoving down our throat when they give us that money. Yes, ma'am.
I attended two things. I attended a lecture, and one of the Lone Star board members, Ron Trowbridge, told us that hidden within the Obamacare Act is a provision that, for instance, Lone Star hires one teacher for 30 hours or less, but it's the last employer, that under the Obamacare, the provision is that college or community college has to pay all the benefits and pension for that teacher. He said estimating Lone Star can be from between $2 and $3 billion in costs. No one has brought that up, so that's going to fall on the property tax owner, which funds the local colleges. Number one, so there's lots of things coming down the pipe, and I think it's very good of you to have thought of moving away from the property tax, because, not to be conspiratorial, but it's the one place that people are unable to hold on to their homes at some point due to that one tax which they cannot avoid. They've lost their wealth, pretty much.
I think we have, great opportunity to explore how. Remember Nancy Reagan said, "Just say no." Remember that was kind of her thing. She was doing the trying to get folks to quit using illicit drugs and saying, "Just say no." I think we haven't really learned how to do that in government, and so we all talk about pushing back against the federal government, but we don't really know what that looks like. But we don't even know how to do it at the local level. If you go to any county commissioners meeting or city council meeting, is that you agreeing with me, Brian? You'll often hear them talk about unfunded mandates, right? That we have to do this because the state said. And we had a number of citizens in our county some years ago ask our county commissioners, well, what happens if we don't?
Right.
Under what authority can they make us do X, Y, or Z? And I think that, to the college board, what happens if we don't? And how do we really begin to push back against government, whether it's city government or county government or state government or federal government that's overstepping the bounds and reach of what a government authority ought to be doing? And the state of Texas needs some leaders, frankly, who will talk about those ideas. How do we do that? Jefferson and Madison said states did it against the federal government with nullification and interposition. We haven't really explored what that looks like and how to use it. We've talked about these federal lawsuits, and Attorney General Abbott has, gone up with the best of them to try to argue before the Supreme Court, but that's asking your mother-in-law to intercede in an argument between you and your spouse. It's not an unbiased opinion. The court is an arm of the federal government, and asking it for its opinion about what is or is not constitutional is a little bit foolish. Jefferson and Madison knew that. They said the states will decide what is and what is not constitutional. If your state doesn't believe it is, then you interpose against it or you nullify against it. We ought to be looking for opportunities as leaders in Texas to do
I
that.
agree. Are you sure you're not supposed to be running for governor?
I am. But I'm going to give the governor lots of help. How about that? Lots of assist.
That'd be great.
We've got to do that, and it's follow the money, right? So don't you want somebody in that office who's independent, who will think, who will push, who will ask questions, who will turn over rocks even when it's not, I really don't enjoy that. I'm not sure why the Lord bent me that way. But boy, wrong just gets all over me. And I don't know how to do anything else. I want to do it fairly. I don't want to do it vindictively or viciously, but by golly, we all deserve an opportunity to live free and prosperous. And when our government takes our freedom from us, whether it's telling us what to inject into our children, or how many people to hire, or what kind of benefits to pay to our employees, it destroys freedom. And when you destroy freedom, we will all quit producing. If you take from me what I produce, I quit producing. And when we do that collectively as a society, we will suffer. Why does it matter that we're prosperous? Because prosperity gives us better food, better education, a cleaner environment. It's not just about how much money we have in our bank account. It's about how safe we are and what the quality of our life is. And when we promote the ideas of a free market, everybody in the society is better off. Yes, ma'am.
If you said how long you've been in public service, I didn't catch that, but obviously you have been. So what do you personally do as the number one thing that you do to keep from drinking the Kool-Aid? Because obviously I don't think you have. I think maybe surround myself with good people. I have a pretty strong personality, and Brian Crumby was with me at the state convention in 2008 when I sued the Republican Party of Texas. It was a really tough thing to do, but they were doing wrong, and I didn't want to do it, and I tried everything I could to avoid it, and I didn't. And that whole process, I said, how do we not become, because there were a lot of folks that were standing with us and saying, finally somebody, but as soon as you get power, it's easy for me now, right? She's the unelected, she's the challenger, she's the one. How do we know when Deborah Medina gets into office, she won't do the very things that she's been campaigning against? That's right.
And all I can say to you is it has been a question at the forefront of my mind the whole time I've been publicly active. How do I keep my own integrity? I've often said I'm a wife and a mother, and I never want to walk through my front door and have my children look at me and say, we don't know who you are. We don't know who you are. And maybe that's what will make me stay the course. I think you pull me out of office. I think that's a real important thing. We never put people in danger, except in politics. We do not put people in dangerous positions for prolonged periods of time. We don't send a soldier to war and leave him on the battlefield forever. We bring him back. We don't even put deacons in service in our church in perpetuity We put them in service for a couple years and we bring them back. We send police officers undercover and we bring them back. But we put politicians who we know have tremendous power there, and we leave them there. And so I've had people argue and say, well, you'll bring good people home, and I said, I hope so. I hope we send good men and women into office and we bring good people home, because there's lots of good people that can serve. And I think we have to do that. I think we have to, not to punish those folks, but to protect them from the corruption that inevitably comes when you're that close to that much power.
Yeah, very good.
I think when you said earlier that you want to help the governor, I think you need to, I think you could be the person that could give him HEL.
Thank you all. I know you have a lot on your agenda still for this evening. I need your support. If you didn't get to sign up on our sheet, the website is medinafortexas.com, and stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, I want to be, because we do have a good-sized crowd, but we also have a lot of candidates here, I'd like to give each of the candidates, and I'll have to time you, because I have found in this position that I will give people 2 minutes and they'll take 30. So I'd like to give each of the candidates a minute to come up and talk, because we have a lot of other things to cover tonight. But a minute to come up and say who you are, what you're running for, and whatever you can do in a minute. So, which candidate wants to go first?